is Paul Chapman. He runs a podcast called The Greatest Movie Ever. It is actually one of the first podcasts I ever listened to, and I still listen to this day, so it's a great pleasure to have him on the show. I recently just made my first debut, or I guess it's always your first debut. I made my debut on his podcast just earlier today, so thank you, Paul, for coming by.
Oh, good to have me. Let me say that again. It's good to be here. Glad you're having me. I do have to make a small correction, though. It's spelled Paul Thomas Chapman, but it's pronounced throat wobbler mangrove.
Ah, okay. I will make sure to correct that in editing.
No.
Now,
how you doing?
I'm doing all right. Where did you come up with the idea? Well, first of all, let me tell you the story of how I found your podcast was completely by accident. The first podcast I ever found was Geekscape, which is the host of Saint Mort Show. And one of the guys on Geekscape was like, hey, I have a new podcast called The Worst Movie Ever. And I was like, oh, I should check this out. And for some reason, I downloaded The Greatest Movie Ever podcast instead. And was like, man.
Yeah. I knew those people when they were still doing The Worst Movie Ever podcast. We corresponded for a little bit, actually.
Yeah, and I was like, this podcast is great. And I told him so, and he was like, that's not my podcast. And Worst Movie Ever was a really great podcast, too, and I really wish that Ivan would consider bringing it back, but that's neither here nor there. Greatest Movie Ever, I actually loved the concept of it, was like, let's look at these movies that are either legitimately the greatest movie ever or ironically the greatest movie ever.
Oh, you use the I word.
I know. It's a bad word to use and people hate it.
Don't use the I word.
But
no, I think I do need to clarify something right there. I, like Daryl Surratt on the Anime World Order podcast, I'm not really a proponent of the concept of ironically enjoying something. Something that might seem to be ironic to other people is something that I find myself genuinely enjoying. I do genuinely enjoy the experience of movies that are often, by traditional standards, quite terrible. But really, at the heart of the Greatest Movie Ever podcast, there's actually a kernel of constructive criticism, which is something that the woman who taught me acting and puppetry in children's theater when I was younger, she had a policy of being able to find something positive to say about even the worst performance from the most amateurish actor. And that's something that I took to heart, that even in films that are colossal failures in one aspect or one element or some sense, there's always something that's done well. And if you can find that, it makes it a worthwhile experience.
There's a quote from one of Chuck Klosterman's books. He defines a guilty pleasure as something you pretend to like ironically, but actually legitimately like, which I always like to use. Now, you've watched some terrible movies for this podcast, and I refuse to listen to any episodes on movies that I haven't seen, but on the same flip side, I try to listen to every episode. So because of you, I've watched movies like Next.
I'm sorry. I apologize.
Just yesterday, I finished watching Flash Gordon for the first time, which actually wasn't as terrible as expected. But I have to ask, of all of the movies that you've done, and you've done quite a few, I would say well over 100, what was probably the most painful one that you couldn't even pretend to say was the greatest movie ever?
Well, you have to remember that some of the more painful experiences I haven't actually recorded or published yet. But in terms of just, I hate this freaking movie, this is really not fun, not enjoyable, but I feel like I need to talk about it, is probably going to be the upcoming podcast that I'll be doing with Daryl Surratt and celebrity translator Neil Nadelman about the Nicolas Cage, Alex Proyas opus that is known as Knowing.
Oh.
And the basic premise is how do you go from Dark City to this? What was Roger Ebert thinking when he lauded Nicolas Cage's acting in that film?
I hope that I know that it hasn't come up as of recently because as the years go by, siblings do different things. I love listening to the episodes where you force your sister Catherine to watch movies that you know that she is going to completely despise. And it seems like it's just so sadistic, but it's so enjoyable to listen to as she's just like, I don't like these things, and you always pick the movies that have these things in them.
And yet she keeps recording with me.
You'd think that eventually she'd just be like, you know what, I'm not doing any more podcasts with you, Paul.
It goes back to everything I learned from show business. I learned from a woman now deceased named Norma Bigler, and one of the things that she would talk about was sort of like trust exercises that they do in theater in terms of staging a scene and how big you can play it. She would say, as the director, I'm going to push you to the very edge of the cliff, but I'm not going to let you jump off of it. So that's sort of where I stand when it comes to picking for movies with Catherine and my mother. They're my family members, and they have to love me no matter what I do. So I can't abuse that trust, but I can push the envelope.
I definitely enjoy when you made your mom watch The Prophecy. Or just Prophecy. Not
just Prophecy. The Prophecy is Christopher Walken.
Yeah, Prophecy has the greatest death of anybody in a sleeping bag, for those of you who hasn't seen it.
I'm just wondering what it's going to be like when I actually sit her down and get her to try and explain what goes on in Fist of the North Star.
Oh, are you doing live action or anime?
We already did the live action with Mike Toole and Daryl Surratt. This is going to be the animated version with the Streamline Pictures dub. It's like, okay, Mom, now what happens now?
Today I got to, we're recording this on Easter. I had my uncle ask me my opinions on Human Centipede, so that was an interesting life in being, having an uncle who knows that you like a lot of really demented movies. He's like, I was thinking about on-demanding that. Do you think it's good?
It's one of those things where I think they're trying too hard.
My problem with Human Centipede when I sat down and watched it, I actually was lucky enough to get a screener copy of it. The way that I reviewed it was that I tweeted while watching the movie and called it Human Centitweet. And the problem with that movie, beyond a lot of the obvious things, like you said, they're trying so hard, is that the movie just never decided if it was trying to be a comedy or if it was legitimately trying to be scary. And for those of you who haven't seen it, they literally turn into the Human Centipede within the first 15 minutes of the movie. And then it's just kind of boring. Like, you're like, okay, I've seen it. I've still got an hour and a half to go. Like, it's kind of, it would have been an interesting short film, maybe, for just, like, shock value. But as almost a 2-hour-long movie, which I have to put quotes around, no.
That's the kind of concept that could only be pulled off by the likes of Shinya Tsukamoto or possibly Takashi Miike. One of those crazy Japanese filmmakers that has an extremely artistic bent if you can contain them long enough,
Yeah, now, did you think when you started this podcast that you'd be doing this for as many years as you have?
It's been almost 5 at this point. I don't really ever intend to stop. As long as I can afford the bandwidth and the web space and everything like that. I like hearing myself talk, and it gives me an excuse to do what I want to do anyway, which is watch terrible movies. And it's opened up doors for me that I never would have anticipated. I've gotten feedback from fans all over the world, and people have even told me that listening to my podcast helps them get through their day at work. So in some small way, I'm making people's lives better, and that's very fulfilling for me.
Yeah, I would say even from a fellow podcasting standpoint, people talk about a lot, and obviously, the world of podcasting is mostly dominated by people like Mark Maron or Chris Hardwick, who have already established names, but it's amazing how many doors, especially if you're a young writer or a wannabe comedian or any of those things, how many doors a podcast actually opens up for you opportunity-wise. Through this show, and this is only episode 8, I've met so many people who I've loved and got to talk to for 10, 15 minutes, that it's been worth it. Even if I don't do, maybe I say do 2 or 3 more episodes, like, I can still look back fondly at this and said, I got to meet Mink Stoll because of this. Like, you know, I got to talk to George Hardy from Troll 2 for an hour. Like, I recommend everybody out there who thinks that they can do a podcast to just do it. Like, just try it out. It's not as much work as you would imagine it would be, but it's also not as easy as you think it would be. But I mean, I don't know about you, but it takes me maybe 2-3 hours worth of editing for the podcast. But compared to what else I do with my free time, it's not really that bad. Like,
the way I edit it takes me about 4 times as much as the recording itself. So if I'm going to have a half hour of finished product, it takes me maybe 2 hours of straight editing in the chair to get to that point. I edit pretty tightly, though, you know, and sometimes I like the way it sounds. Sometimes I'm a little disappointed, but that's just the neurotic perfectionist in me working at it. It can be a lot of work, or you might be gifted and have a natural rapport with people and be able to just put it out there unedited. Some people can actually do that, you know, like the comedians, professional comedians like Paul Scheer on How Did This Get Made, for example.
Yeah.
I don't think puts a lot of editing
now, I know
into his final product.
I know
or if you're rich like Kevin Smith, you can get someone else to edit it for you.
Yeah. I know Geekscape is all just one camera shot for an hour with no editing whatsoever, except for like opening and closing credits. Now, the theme, you started doing a lot of themes, which I don't remember 3 years ago there being that many themes, but, you know, now there's been the year of Cage and the month of H.P. Lovecraft. Has this just been something for your own personal enjoyment, or have you always wanted to, like, was this a new idea, or did you always want to eventually start doing themed years and months?
I don't know what it is exactly that put me onto the idea of theme blocks of programming. I think the first one that I did was The Most Dangerous Month, the Hunt You Like an Animal, where, you know, humans being hunted for sport and profit. It just seems like a natural sort of progression to... I'm one of those people that I tend to categorize things, you know, and organize things in my brain. Something about theme months, or in the case of the Nicolas Cage theme year, just seems like a natural extension of that. Like, I know that there are certain properties that I want to talk about, but they only make sense in a grander context. You know, I don't think it would be appropriate to just talk about Reanimator or just talk about the Call of Cthulhu silent film without talking about Lovecraft in general and his adaptations into films in specific. I'm actually working on additional theme months that are just in the planning stages at the moment, because getting them together and recorded in a timely manner is a tremendous amount of work. But it's something that I like to do, and it's one of those things that makes sense to me.
Can you reveal what some of these future themes may be for people who might want to start checking in?
Well, I put a poll up on the Greatest Movie Ever podcast a while ago that suggest potential theme months to be done in the future, and all of those ideas are something I do intend to do at some point. So yes, there will be a Shack Attack. It's just a matter of when.
And a matter of, you know, the strength to sit through all of those. I've actually been trying to, as you said, you talk about lists, and, you know, being a young filmmaker, I tried to watch all of the AFI's 100 Greatest Movies list, but I've also tried to watch...
Why would you do that to yourself?
I've also tried to watch all of IMDb's bottom 100, which is, A, impossible because that list changes literally every other hour, but B, I've had to suffer through so many Paris Hilton starring films from National Lampoon that it is disgusting. Pledge This and The Hills are both pretty high ranking on the worst experiences of my entire life. And I think it's through movies like that I find an ability to appreciate movies that other people tend to hate. Because I can look at them and say, you haven't watched The Hills, spelled with a Z, that's played like a serious drama about gang life and drugs, starring Paris Hilton. Well, thank you for coming by, Paul. Where can people go and check out the podcast and, eventually, whenever my episode goes up where we reviewed Freaked, which I consider to be one of the greatest movies ever?
You can find the Greatest Movie Ever podcast at www.fearthegooberzilla.com. You can also find it at just simply gooberzilla.wordpress.com. That's the blog where you can see our archives and post comments and stuff like that, get the RSS feed. It's like, I'm not a web designer. It's just like, whatever I slap together, and it's I've been criticized by many people about the format of it, but if you want to do the page for me, you got better suggestions and want to do it for free, you're welcome to it. I also have another podcast that's a little more personal called the Silicon Chickens Project, in which I write, edit, and perform my own works of short fiction, both humorous and macabre, and that you can find at siliconchickens.wordpress.com.
Nice.